Truth and Knowledge. On Solipsism and Other Minds. By Felipe Bautista. Preface. The author of the present exposition desires to make clear here, at the outset, that his thoughts herein were written in response to a recent discussion published by one Mr. Matt Gray, host of the very laudable Cheltenham and UK Philosophers podcast, concerning the very weighty question of the knowledge of other minds. The author does not pretend to have treated the question here exhaustively, and he is convinced firmly that the question deserves more attention and treatment than has been here given. Yet, the aim of the present exposition, it should be said, is not to provide an exhaustive treatment of the question, but rather to, hopefully satisfactorily, address Mr. Gray's concerns as it pertains to this profound theme. That being said, the author hopes here to have satisfactorily addressed the concerns raised by Mr. Gray, even if, given the profundity and magnitude of the question with which we are now here dealing, a more exhaustive treatment of such weighty an issue remains a desideratum. Felipe Bautista, Chicago, Illinois, January 29, 2025. Any knowledge that professes to hold a priori lays claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. This applies still more to any determination of all pure a priori knowledge, since such determination has to serve as the measure and therefore as the supreme example of all apodeictic philosophical certainty. Immanuel Kant. How can I know a priori that other minds, finite or eternal, exist besides myself? I cannot, because it is logically possible that solipsism, that is, egoism, is actually the case, such that there is no continued existence of objects after they no longer appear to the senses, and such that there exist no other minds besides myself with their own corresponding thoughts and perceptions. Therefore, if I am to arrive at knowledge of the existence of other minds, I must employ an a posteriori approach. Yet, the a posteriori approach cannot possibly suffice here either, because as Hume so plainly put it in his influential treatise of human nature, that our senses offer not their impressions as the images of something distinct, or independent, and external, is evident, because they convey to us nothing but a single perception, and never give us the least intimation of anything beyond. A single perception can never produce the idea of a double existence, but by some inference either of the reason or imagination. When the mind looks farther than what immediately appears to it, its conclusions can never be put to the account of the senses. And it certainly looks farther when, from a single perception, it infers a double existence, and supposes the relations of resemblance and causation betwixt them. It follows, therefore, that I can know, neither a priori nor a posteriori, that other minds, finite or eternal, have existence outside myself. It is logically possible that I am the sole reality, as a mind generating representations to, for, by, and as itself, using the term representations in the Kantian sense, there being no transcendental reality independent of my consciousness activity, using the term transcendental reality also in the Kantian sense. Footnote. Needless to say, the subject-object identity is implied when we say, as itself. End of footnote. Even though I think that I am a man, for all that, it is logically possible that I may suddenly awaken to discover that I am actually a butterfly that was only dreaming of being a man. See Zhuangzi. Furthermore, a butterfly that lives in a world where mankind never even came into existence. Additionally, it is logically possible that, in turn, I am not even such an aforesaid butterfly. And I may yet further awaken to discover that I am actually a rhinoceros that was only dreaming of being said aforesaid butterfly. Furthermore, a rhinoceros that lives in a world where neither men nor butterflies ever even came into existence. In other words, not only is it logically possible that there is no continued existence of objects, whether houses, mountains, rivers, men, etc., after they no longer appear to the senses, but it is also therefore logically possible that the sole reality is myself, as a mind, entertaining itself with its own immanent representations, there being no transcendental reality independent of my consciousness activity. That is, it is logically possible that no empirical environment is base reality, but only a contingent empirical scenario corresponding to the dream I, as a mind generating representations to, for, by, and as itself, just so happen to be presently, as it were, dreaming. Additionally, if the sole reality is myself, as a mind generating representations to, for, by, and as itself, then eo ipso, I myself, as a mind, am not only base reality, but reality to core. And potentially even an eternal mind too, not in the sense that I perceive all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, because that would be illegitimately taking for granted transcendental realism, and that the empirical environment I now experience is base reality, and thus illegitimately privileging an empirical environment that ultimately may be nothing more than ephemeral representations in me. But rather in the sense that, even though the objects of the senses have no continued existence after they no longer appear to the senses, I am an eternal dreamer dreaming non-eternal dreams. Of course, this raises intriguing questions concerning freedom, questions which, however, fall outside the scope of the present investigation, which investigation is specifically focused on the possibility of the knowledge of other minds. Suffice it here to say that I cannot know that I am free either a priori or a posteriori. Not a priori, because it is logically possible that I am the property of some other deeper substance that is the source of all my actions. Not a posteriori, because, when the mind looks farther than what immediately appears to it, its conclusions can never be put to the account of the senses. Psychological questions arise too. For example, if I am a mind generating representations to, for, by, and as itself, then why these representations, as opposed to others? Nevertheless, though the psychological questions, and the questions concerning freedom, are intriguing, what we are concerned with here is the possibility of the knowledge, a priori or a posteriori, of other minds beyond myself. Summa summarum, I can know neither a priori nor a posteriori whether other minds exist besides myself. I can know neither a priori nor a posteriori whether I am ultimately free or the property of some other deeper substance that is the source of all my actions. And I can know neither a priori nor a posteriori whether I am the sole reality or a constituent of a broader transcendental reality beyond my own consciousness activity. These three parallel limitations flow from the same fundamental epistemic constraint, namely, my inability to verify anything beyond my immediate consciousness activity either through reason or experience. My aim in the present discourse is to reply to the counter-arguments against solipsism issued by one Mr. Matt Gray in his recent YouTube video critiquing solipsism, Mr. Gray being not only an advocate for making philosophical discussions accessible to the general public, but also the host of the estimable Cheltenham and UK Philosophers podcast. Mr. Gray's counter-arguments against solipsism can be divided into two general heads, the pragmatic and the philosophical. As it pertains to the pragmatic counter-arguments issued by Mr. Matt Gray in his critique, I will here take the liberty of being very brief in my reply. This, because Mr. Gray and myself are perfectly in accord and in perfect agreement in this regard. In his critique of solipsism, Mr. Gray proclaimed, quote, I don't know for certain that other minds exist, but I'm going to proceed pragmatically according to the notion that they do, end of quote. In turn, in my recent exposition of solipsism, a video on my YouTube channel entitled Berkeley and Solipsism, I explicitly affirmed that it should be noted that it does not follow that, because speculative reason is insufficient to substantiate the constitutive existence of other minds, whether finite or eternal, I cannot uphold the regulative validity of the idea of other minds on the basis of practical reason. Just as Kant argued that certain ideas, like freedom, immortality, and God, could be justified through practical reason despite lying beyond the reach of speculative reason, we might similarly justify belief in other minds as a practical necessity while maintaining theoretical agnosticism about their constitutive existence. Both Mr. Gray and myself agree, that is, that, though we cannot know that other minds exist, practical reason is nevertheless a sufficient basis to support the maintenance of the regulative validity of the idea of other minds. That being said, I should like now to turn to Mr. Gray's more philosophical counter-arguments. As a preamble to my reply to Mr. Gray's more philosophical counter-arguments, I should like here to take the opportunity to refer to Fichte's review of Schulz's Aeneas Oedimus, wherein Fichte observed that the transcendental realist criterion of truth has been the common source of all the objections, skeptical as well as dogmatic, which have been raised against the critical philosophy. Fichte's observation, as well as the distinction between the transcendental and empirical realist criteria of truth, a discussion of which distinction we shall now enter into, will underpin all that follows. According to the transcendental realist criterion of truth, my mind's representations represent their objects only by virtue of some kind of similarity with or resemblance to them. In turn, according to the empirical realist criterion, the postulate bearing on the knowledge of things as actual does not indeed demand immediate perception and therefore sensation of which we are conscious, of the object whose existence is to be known. What we do, however, require is the connection of the object with some actual perception in accordance with the analogies of experience, which define all real connection in an experience in general. In other words, according to the empirical realist criterion, representations represent their objects only because they are synthesized according to rules. In a nutshell, representation consists not in resemblance to a thing, but in conformity to rule. As Frederick C. Beiser notes, in his book on German idealism, when elaborating on the empirical realist criterion of truth, simply because the structure of my experience itself does not correspond with things in themselves does not mean that all propositions affirmed within it are false. On the contrary, as Kant argued in the Aesthetic, their truth can remain the same whether the framework has transcendental reality or ideality. As long as the structure or organization of the whole web of belief remains the same, there will be no discernible difference between truth and falsity. So, ultimately, Cartesian doubt, which arises if, and only if, one adopts the transcendental realist criterion, does not really matter. Mr. Matt Gray, when enumerating his more philosophical, that is, less pragmatically oriented, counter-arguments against solipsism, refers to Wittgenstein's private language argument. With reference to such aforesaid private language argument, Mr. Gray tells us as follows. Quote, language could not emerge in a single mind because the validity of sentences and propositions could never be truly verified. And they can only be verified by an external third party because self-verification could be self-delusion. End of quote. That Mr. Gray's appeal to his understanding of the private language argument here tacitly involves the adoption of the transcendental realist criterion of truth is evident. Nevertheless, the truth and validity of sentences and propositions can remain the same whether the framework of my experience has transcendental reality or ideality. As long as the structure or organization of the whole web of belief remains the same, there will be no discernible difference between truth and falsity. In other words, for propositions to be valid under empirical realism, they need only arise in and have reference to the structure of my experience. Such that Mr. Gray's counter-argument here simply begs the question against the solipsist who need not adopt the transcendental realist criterion of truth. It is logically possible, as we have seen above, that solipsism is actually the case, such that it is not necessary to adopt the transcendental realist criterion of truth at all. Insofar as we do adopt the transcendental realist criterion of truth, not only do we immediately become vulnerable to Cartesian skepticism, since, after all, a malicious demon may be deceiving me, but we simply just beg the question and take for granted the transcendental reality now in question. If objectivity is sought in empirical rather than transcendental realism, then ultimately Cartesian doubt, which arises if, and only if, one adopts the transcendental realist criterion, does not really matter. Such that I can sufficiently establish objectivity not by insisting that my representations, including language, resemble some transcendent thing in itself, but because they conform to rule and have reference to the unity of apperception. Mr. Gray's appeal to his formulation of the private language argument here already begs the question by taking for granted that there is a transcendental reality which must be the basis of objectivity. Yet, the truth of propositions can remain the same whether the framework of my experience, including the representation I call language, has transcendental reality or ideality. To his credit, Mr. Gray does acknowledge that he may be begging the question when he says that, quote, I think I'm intuitively pulled towards the idea that there are other minds, so I think I'm gonna seek out the benefits of these arguments, such as the private language argument, those things that reinforce my view, so I have to factor that in as well, end of quote. At any rate, it should also be noted here that, when Mr. Gray suggests that propositions can only be verified by an external third party, not only is he already taking for granted the transcendental reality that is here in question, but there is sophisma figurae dictionis involved in his suggestion here too. Namely, ambiguity arising from a confusion between the transcendental and empirical use of a concept. The expression, outside us, is thus unavoidably ambiguous in meaning, tells us Immanuel Kant. Sometimes signifying what as thing in itself exists apart from us, and sometimes what belongs solely to outer appearance. In order, therefore, to make this concept, in the latter sense, the sense in which the psychological question as to the reality of our outer intuition has to be understood. Quite unambiguous, we shall distinguish empirically external objects from those which may be said to be external in the transcendental sense, by explicitly entitling the former, things which are to be found in space. Moreover, Mr. Gray then proceeds to ask, why would anyone want to be a member of a group if they didn't believe those group members exist? But once again Mr. Gray is already taking for granted the transcendental realist criterion of truth here. Indeed, the transcendental realist criterion of truth has been the common source of all the objections, skeptical as well as dogmatic, which have been raised against the critical philosophy. The solipsist may sufficiently establish the reality or actuality of his fellow group members not by taking for granted the transcendental realist criterion of truth that Mr. Gray adopts, but by an adoption of the empirical realist criterion of truth. The reality or actuality of my fellow group members can remain the same whether the framework of my experience has transcendental reality or ideality under empirical realism. Such that the transcendental realist criterion adopted by Mr. Gray is not necessary for the establishment of objectivity, and worse, leads always and inevitably straight to Cartesian skepticism. Viz., once we admit that we have to deal with nothing more than our own representations, it becomes necessary to account for the concept of the object within the realm of consciousness itself. This concept admits of a perfectly adequate analysis within this realm, Kant argues, as that which confers necessity upon our representations, preventing them from being arbitrary and chaotic. What gives them such necessity, he continues, is the unity of rule, the synthesis of representations through a common function of the mind for combining it in one representation. Mr. Gray then raises a very important question. He asks, given the choice, why would you choose to prefer solipsism over pluralism? After raising this important question, Mr. Gray then tells us that, concerning whether other minds exist beyond myself, quote, the Kantian threshold says that you just don't know, end of quote. And I agree with Mr. Gray wholeheartedly here. One simply cannot know. However, Mr. Gray then asks a follow-up question. He asks, why not prefer to accept that your mom is real, and that our children are real, and that our friends are real? In other words, he asks, why not choose that version of events, the pluralist version that is, over the one where they're not real? Now, that Mr. Gray is once again tacitly taking for granted the transcendental realist criterion of truth here is evident. Mr. Gray is simply taking for granted the transcendental reality which is in question here by tacitly presupposing that truth must be based on the transcendental realist criterion or on nothing at all. He is, that is, simply taking for granted that the truth of my representations must be based on resemblance to a transcendental reality rather than conformity to rule. The solipsist, insofar as he adopts the empirical realist criterion of truth, can perfectly agree that his neighbors are real. Not because there is some transcendental reality, to say nothing of the fact that the affirmation of a transcendental reality is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. Rather, the empirical realist solipsist can admit that his neighbors are real on the basis of the unity of rule. Mr. Gray's question concerning whether we should accept dogmatic solipsism or not is misguided because it presupposes that the only possible criterion of truth is the transcendental realist criterion. Yet, once we admit that we have to deal with nothing more than our own representations, it becomes necessary to account for the concept of the object within the realm of consciousness itself. The question Mr. Gray should really consider asking, I insist, is, why prefer the transcendental realist criterion, which leads inevitably always to skepticism, over the empirical realist criterion, according to which truth can remain the same whether the framework has transcendental reality or ideality? The man, butterfly, and rhinoceros, who adopt the transcendental realist criterion of truth, will always find themselves in Cartesian skepticism when they carry their investigations to their limits, because they will be forced to acknowledge that they may be some other creature entirely different, dreaming, or that a malicious demon is at work behind the scenes. However, if they accept the empirical realist criterion, then they need not trouble themselves concerning what, if anything, there is beyond their representations, because what sufficiently establishes their objectivity is the unity of rule, the synthesis of representations through a common function of the mind for combining it in one representation. Mr. Gray, incidentally, seems to want to endorse empirical realism when he, at one point in his critique of solipsism, says, quote, "If we stay in the realm of discussing whether or not there are transcendently real other minds, then we get stuck in the traps, when we could be galloping ahead and theorizing about things that really matter to us in our experiential realm, like nature, physics, ethics, etc." End of quote. Mr. Gray is basically, here, whether he is aware of it or not, endorsing what I have been endorsing hitherto, namely, not only the utility of empirical realism but also the fruitlessness of transcendental realism and the dogmatic speculative metaphysics which always goes along with it. Like Mr. Gray, I wholeheartedly agree that, if we stay stuck in the realm of discussing transcendental reality, then we get stuck in the traps, when we could be galloping ahead and theorizing about things that really matter to us in our experiential realm. As I said, although he may not be fully aware of it, it seems that Mr. Gray wants to adopt empirical over transcendental realism here. Only the empirical realist will say something like, we could be galloping ahead and theorizing about things that really matter to us in our experiential realm, as opposed to futilely speculating about what, if anything, there is beyond the structure of my experience, whether other minds, malicious demons, or what have you. Once we admit that we have to deal with nothing more than our own representations, it becomes necessary to account for the concept of the object within the realm of consciousness itself. Mr. Gray then proceeds to tell us that, quote, "Science involves free miracles and assumptions to be able to make progress, so I'm suggesting that the free miracle and assumption that we need to make progress with metaphysics and science is the assumption that other minds exist." End of quote. Yet, even after tacitly endorsing the empirical realist criterion of truth as we've just seen, once again, here Mr. Gray is simply taking for granted the transcendental realist criterion of truth, as if the existence of other minds must be grounded in their transcendental reality, even when the existence of other minds can be sufficiently established under empirical realism. My friends, family, and neighbors are real, under empirical realism, not because my representations resemble some transcendent thing in itself, but because my representations, including my representations of my friends, family, and neighbors, align with the rules and structure of my experience. As writes Friedrich C. Beiser in his German idealism book, following Kant's analysis of the concept of an object in the analytic, the object of experience consists in more than any conjunction of mere perceptions or representations, because it also involves a. their systematic order, lawful unity or interconnection, and b. their locatability in a single universal space. Such an object is indeed distinct from its representations or appearances, though not in an ontological sense as an entity existing apart from them, but only in a formal sense as a whole whose individual perceptions are only its parts. This is to say that the refutation of idealism attempts to establish the existence of an object in Kant's own technical sense of existence or actuality, whatever is connected with a perception according to empirical laws is actual, wirklich. While the refutation of idealism is therefore consistent with the transcendental deduction and transcendental idealism as a whole, according to which we can know only appearances, it also marks an advance over Kant's critique of empirical idealism in the first edition Fourth Paralogism, because there, Kant had too simplistically equated appearances with representations themselves, leaving himself open to obvious skeptical objections. Although I and Mr. Gray agree that, though I don't know for certain that other minds exist, I'm going to proceed pragmatically according to the notion that they do, we differ in the criterion of truth we adopt, even if Mr. Gray vacillates concerning which criterion of truth he wants to uphold, as we've seen. As I suggested earlier, however, perhaps the question of why accept solipsism over pluralism is the wrong question. And I'd encourage Mr. Gray to consider asking the more important question of why prefer the transcendental realist criterion of truth over the empirical realist criterion. This, of course, is not to suggest that the empirical realist criterion is without its own problems. After all, anyone acquainted with the excellent Maimonides' writings, which are tragically too little read, will be quite aware that the empirical realist criterion itself faces its own challenges. Nevertheless, the significance of Maimonides' excellent writings and their relevance to the issue of empirical versus transcendental realism is another discussion for another day. That being said, I'd like here to take the opportunity to thank Mr. Gray, not only for his excellent discussion on the theme of solipsism in his critique, and for the attention with which he has treated this profound and intricate topic, but also for his contributions to the philosophical community more broadly as host of the laudable Cheltenham and UK Philosophers podcast. Though I and Mr. Gray have agreed when it comes to our pragmatic stance towards the issue of solipsism, namely, we both insist on the regulative validity of the idea of other minds, we nevertheless differ when it comes to our choice of criterion of truth. Mr. Gray tends towards transcendental realism, whereas I tend towards empirical realism, even if Mr. Gray, as we've seen, does vacillate here. Yet, though I differ from Mr. Gray as it pertains to the criterion of truth I adopt in my philosophizing, I must confess this difference is in direct proportion to the debt of gratitude I owe to him and his tireless efforts in running his Cheltenham and UK Philosophers podcast, which efforts and podcast can be nothing short of advantageous, profitable, and serviceable to philosophy, science, and learning. Obiter Dicta. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. Genesis 3:4, King James Version.